you should still live your life the way
Yes.
that brings positivity to it. But
Yes.
there can be learnings from it that allows you to optimize some things. But then when you want to optimize something, like pick one thing. Like don't start out like trying to do everything at one time.
All right, welcome to the Greg Bennett Show, presented by Volage Health. I'm your host, Greg Bennett, and today I have the privilege of welcoming back one of the most impactful coaches in the endurance world, Olav Aleksander Bu. Olav's scientific approach to coaching has led to unprecedented success, including Olympic triumphs, world championships, and performances that just continue to redefine endurance sports. His journey with athletes like Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden has just captivated the sports world, and he's now bringing his innovative methods to a new frontier as the head coach for Norwegian cycling. And today we'll be discussing his work with Kristian and Gustav, his transition into cycling, and his role in advancing the core body temperature sensor for optimizing heat adaptation in training. And we'll also try and get to all the questions that have been sent in, of which there have been numerous. So, without further ado, welcome back to the Greg Bennett Show. Olive, how are you, mate? It's good to have you back.
My privilege always with the intro and I love our conversation. So thank you very much for having me back.
Oh, you're welcome, mate. We just so people know, you and I do talk offline a bit. I don't know. I love our chats. Even over the last 6 months since I last had you on the show, I think you and I kind of hit it off pretty well, and we've had a lot of conversations, all things health, performance, longevity, and everything else. So even though it's 6 months since we've recorded a show, you and I have had quite a lot of conversations, and it is always just wonderful. I feel like an hour just flies by with you. So thanks again for making it happen, buddy.
Yeah, the same. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Now you missed Kona due to illness this year. How are you feeling now? You recovered and okay?
Yeah, now like the whole family was down. It started. I think it was first my son, then it was my daughter, and my wife, and myself. So basically, it was the whole family that was down. And
Brutal.
when I finally recovered, it was so close to the race that it really didn't make sense to jump on the plane and fly for 24 hours plus to just get to the race.
Because
So
you'd been in Tucson though, right? You were with the boys in Tucson with Christoph, and then you went back to Norway, or did you get sick in Tucson?
yeah, so actually, I was flying over, so I had an appointment in Austin, and then I continued onwards to Flagstaff to be with Kristian and Gustav. But that was a little bit more than a week, 1.5 week. I stayed with them, or 1 week. I don't remember exactly. Before I returned back to Norway. So
Right.
I have to say a little bit fun. It's a stark contrast to the previous years, where I basically spent more than 200 days together with them, and to the period that has been now. But anyways, sickness and other things, it's not much one can do about it. And obviously there has been a couple of other changes too. In life, as you just mentioned initially.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and you've got kids the same age as me, and when you're on the road for 200 plus days a year, it really does become a lot. This year, you decreased that a fair bit, right? You weren't quite as much. You kind of were, I wouldn't say phasing yourself out, but just being more conscious of the amount of days you were spending on the road.
Yeah, I think to be honest, it was unfortunately not like I was crying because I lost my trip to Kona. Because travel, I can say that all the previous years leading, and then obviously accumulating into of the first Olympics, but then Kona in 2022, St. George, and then Kona 2022. Um, I think we were so focused on all these kind of things, and it just had to be that way. But after Kona, I remember sitting on the plane back from Kona 2022. I was so tired. I barely knew upside down, and you can imagine I'm quite used to like a really high paced life with all the projects, research projects, like everything that have happened around us all the time. But and obviously, I like stress. I like high pace. I like people that are dedicated, a lot of energy, and these kind of things. But sitting on the plane back from Kona 2022, I was so exhausted. I literally didn't know upside down on myself, to the point where I was thinking, like, if I don't get a chronic disease now, then
Yeah.
then I don't know. But then after there, I think for myself, I actually, every travel, it's a little bit funny, but every travel after Kona 2022, it was to the point where I almost like, I tried to push every travel like one day further, and that was also, I can say now, also going to Kona. It was not. I love to be with the boys. They are my second family. Like, I spend so much time with them. They are so unique, two really unique human beings, not only in sports and outside of sports. And it's like they're also joking when I say I go home to my family and say, yeah, but we are your family. And there is a very large truth to that. They obviously know my wife and kids very well as well, but yeah, it's one thing is being with them, another thing is the travel. So when I first am with them, then it's no problem, then it's fantastic and all this kind of thing. But then I start, uh, yeah, the travels are tough. They've become really tough the last years.
Yeah, I get it, mate. Look, anybody in this sort of performance field, it gets to the point we always call it push phases, and then we'd always try to, as athletes ourselves, we'd be like, okay, we're not moving anywhere from January 1 to, April 15th or whatever it was, and we're going to do 16 weeks in one place, not moving, not even a road trip, and we would just force ourselves to give a stint where we weren't jumping on planes. These days, I don't have anything like that. I actually get itchy feet going, when are we going again? But it's like the extremes. But look, we got a lot to cover. Like I said in the intro, I put a post out yesterday, as I do quite often with special guests coming on the show, and said, hey, if you got any questions, and typically, I'll get 10 or so questions. You got substantially more than that. So everybody listening, I'm going to do my very best to at least mention your name and touch on your question throughout this show. I've tried to put them through, intertwine them. There are a lot. We have a lot to cover. People are fascinated by your coaching techniques and your thought process. And then are obviously very keen on, discussing some of the athletes' results and everything else. So let's get going. I want to start by sort of just recapping this year. It'd be remiss to not sort of talk about the Olympics. You and I have talked separately about this, but it is a topic that people ask, including, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Blazej Piatzak. And he starts with this: what went wrong in Paris with Kristian Blummenfelt? Now a little harsh, but you got to understand, Instagram DM. It's just trying to get a point across. Let's recap the Olympics with Kristian. What were your thoughts?
Short, like, on the one side, it's or hindsight, or to put it very frank, after Olympics, I actually had weeks where I really didn't sleep, because I was like, everything was churning through my head, like, what did go wrong. But I think also what's important to also know in sports, or anything, most things in life, is that you never get a definitive answer in most cases to what really went wrong. I think if I were to approach it from a high level, we knew that that it was a race which was not perfect for Kristian, because it was the swim. The swim would be a place where he would suffer more than normally. And the second part also, it was that the bike course was also put up in a way that, like, if you came out of the water, you had a good lead on the swim, it would also be tough to catch up for the people coming from behind as well. And that, on the one side, looking at the numbers as well afterwards, it doesn't help that Kristian maybe was 5-6% more or greater capacity now in Paris than what he had in Tokyo, which is already extraordinary. But going out on a bike and then you have to put out 30% more power than what he did in I think it was in Tokyo, or and then also compared to like so the first the first 25 kilometers of the bike part, he was putting out 24% more power than what he needed to do when he was
How much power was he? That's a lot.
yeah,
25%.
without going into the power numbers, but basically it was big power numbers and 30% more power to bridge up. And then we're not talking about 5Ks, we're talking about more than half the race before he was able to bridge up with the front there, and then basically he could drop 30% of the power and still stay at the front or in the front group there of then or let's say the first group there. You don't get that for free. That has a massive cost,
of course.
And then from there, could he have been running faster after that? Very hard to say. It would be tempting to say that, well, if you could do that, why don't we always then bike much harder to do that? But again, I think it has a massive cost, and that's one part of it. The second part, I think, also is that looking back also at it, but this is something we knew became a risk, and that was that the year, let's say 2023, it was a mixture between obviously long course and short course racing, and he won the PTO series. And then, which was on his bucket list, he wanted to win the PTO series. That was something he hadn't won yet. So he had won both. He had taken the 70.3 champs and Ironman champs. He had taken the 70.3 record, the Ironman record, the Olympic gold medal, the world championship.
What's left?
Exactly. Like he and also what is unique, like he won the Olympic gold medal and he won the grand final, a grand final, but also the world championship series. So all three basically, and then on top of that, also the sub 7 project. So like, what more is there left to win? So it became more like, okay, he wanted to do the PTO series, so he did that. So he won the PTO series. But I think the risk with that is that we already take 1 year away from basically honing back and all the details that is necessary to race also on the short course. And then coming into the last year, suddenly there are races that are being cancelled or that doesn't get listed anymore, and there are very, very few races.
It was Abu Dhabi, right? Was cancelled at the start of the year, right? He was already there to do that.
Yeah. And then also Bermuda was out, and then you basically left with Yokohama, and where he underperformed, and then he came to Cagliari and where he punctured. So then you have like one shot left in the magazine, and that's what you want. You want to be already the year before in a position where you have a really good feeling for, okay, what we are doing now is really working. The only thing you need to do the last year is to raise the quality of your do. Not doing anything new, anything like that. Is basically only about raising the quality, and we didn't have that. So inside, I would say that leading into the Olympics, there were a lot of uncertainties. So we just had to go for something we believed in, and Kristian, he had running sessions leading into Olympics that was not only tougher as a brick, where he did more power on the bike, and he ran even 14 kilometers with higher velocity before that. But in the end, you come on race day, and the race is what it is. And I think there, without overcomplicating and overanalyzing, the swim was not for him. The bike, he had to put out 30% more power in the beginning, or let's say the first 25 kilometers than what he did in the front, and that in the end is, you could in many cases say that in the end is enough to just say that, okay, fine, it would be.
I love it.
Yeah,
I can tell you have gone over that. You have gone through everything. It's your engineering brain where it's like, that's a really great answer, in the sense that I know that you have spent a lot of time. That's what makes you so good. But look,
thanks.
2 weeks later, was it 2 weeks later or 1 week later? You
2
went
weeks.
to Frankfurt. 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
goes to Frankfurt Ironman, and he set a record there. Was that the
Yep.
fastest? Yeah, it was insane.
Yeah, blistering fast marathon at the end as well, and yeah, many of the people that were in Kona were there as well. So I think one side he came into that race there, obviously with Olympics. He I think going in there was with very high shoulders, because you don't have the confidence that we had going into Tokyo with, because then we had a long time to prepare. We were really nailing it. We knew already the year before, or actually before COVID, but let's say in 2019, coming in there, test event, we really knew we were exactly at the spot where we wanted to be, and we knew exactly what we needed to do just on quality to be ready for Tokyo. In this race here, we really didn't have that. We came in with high shoulders. And also listening into a podcast with, or not a podcast, or I don't remember, maybe an article or something I read somewhere, like the win Alex took there with the preparation they did, with finding a river that they practiced in several times. Like it was beautiful. It was like, that's how you do it. Like then you can really go into a race low shoulders, because you have really practiced in detail
every variable.
So I loved to hear that like Alex didn't win Olympics by chance. He came there best prepared, and it's well deserved. And then I think the contrary for Kristian coming into Frankfurt, he had the lowest shoulders possible, because he only needed to do the validation. He was already qualified, so it was only a validation needed. And basically, like, we just said, okay, fine, just go through the race here and take it from there. So because he didn't have any expectations to himself, he felt maybe very few had any expectations to him. He goes into the race and is relaxed, and the bike is good. He has obviously, I think, only three rides on his bike, non-race specific, but 3 rides on his bike before Frankfurt, and then he comes there and he really shows what he is good for. The guy has massive capacity, like as we all know. But I think again, coming to Kona, what most people don't know is that he already actually, like, one thing was that he was vomiting on the bike, but he was actually vomiting also the days before. So 2 days.
Was he really? Oh my god!
2 days before, 1 day before, and that you're not talking about any hard session. He was just out easy swimming, and suddenly he gets So the thing is that again, it's not a demonstration of really his capacity, but sometimes you have the expression when shit hits the fan, and I think unfortunately this is a year where shit really has hit the fan, and that's how it is. And then
that's part of the journey, mate. It's part.
Exactly.
I look at it like the stock market. It's the S&P 500. It goes up, and you're like, woohoo, this is amazing. And when we all have our times where it's like this kind of, as long as it's all up and to the right, we kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we steadily keep going up and to the right. We're all pretty happy. And I want to shout out to Russell Simpkins, who did ask, after reflecting on Kristian's Kona performance, did anything stand out as a red flag? And I think you've just answered that. You can't go into races with something going up in your microbiome, your gut. It's just, no, you're not in equilibrium. You've got to get yourself to neutral to be able to perform at your best. So,
and I
big shout out, yeah.
And I think also there was one thing that maybe in a race in a little bit colder climate that would be okay. But one thing that I think you, like, as parents, you learn very quickly, or at least the doctors and other people will tell you very quickly, is that if your child starts to vomit or get like the flu or diarrhea or anything like this, you really need to hydrate a lot, like get fluid, because you get so quickly dehydrated, and that can, of course, for kids that can be dangerous. But also in this case here, okay, maybe it's not dangerous for a grown up, but in terms of performance, you can't have it, because the problem is that one thing we know with plasma, for example, is that plasma is something that you, on the one side, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but one thing that we know with plasma is that that's something you are able to build up very quickly. So already with a week of heat adaptation, you will actually have gained most of the plasma that you will get. And then after there, it's more incremental, smaller or marginal increasements.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know, unfortunately, that plasma is also one of the things that you can really lose very quickly, because it is also directly correlated with body water as well. So when you start to have these reactions, you obviously lose a lot of that. And so Kristian, actually 1 week before, we were sitting on the call, and he had just gone through the like a really large, like they did basically the full Ironman over 2 days. So full swim, 180k bike, and then they did another bike, and then a 42 or 40k run. Everything at race pace. And he says, I feel really much better in terms of heat than what I did in 2022, when he suffered more from much more from the heat. But now he feel like, this feels really good. But again, when you have these kind of reactions, again, we will never have the answer for what really is the cause. But again, Kristian demonstrated what he's good for in Frankfurt. You don't lose that, or
Yeah.
with
Beyond Frankfurt, mate. Beyond Frankfurt. It's
yeah.
like you said earlier,
And,
he's won everything.
and basically also with the specialization, like there was no specialization leading into Frankfurt. Now he had also a little bit time to do a little bit specialization. So if anything, it would maybe be he would be even better. But again, we will never know the answer. But obviously, vomiting and emptying yourself 2 days
No.
before, and then also you're still on the bike. We have to remember, like, he have never vomited on the bike before. He have had reactions on the run, but on the run, we know it is something that it started around in late COVID times. I think this was in maybe April, May 2022. And we have obviously one of the best team doctors in the world on the respiratory system, and we have tried to figure out, but there is something causing that can lead to an irritation in the throat. And again, like I really appreciate people's input and all these kind of things. But again, we also have our team doctor. She is one of the leading experts in the world on the respiratory diseases and so on. And we are still there, that we are trying to figure out the reason for what is happening. But so when he gets this when he vomits actually on the run, which have happened, you can find several races where it has to do that he starts to become so irritated in his throat that it causes this. And this doesn't only happen on races. This actually also happens on training sessions. Luckily, it's not every time, but it do happen when it can be very, very high stress there. And that's also what we see here in Cone. That is actually what you saw in Frankfurt. But the difference between Frankfurt and here is that basically, maybe here, like in Kona, then it was something else. Like again, he had vomited 2 days before, 1 day before, on this day here. But in Frankfurt, what you saw there, that's more like what we have seen several times before, and that is that he ends up with this irritation that becomes so powerful in his throat that it causes a very strong reflux and so on. But again,
wow, I wonder if it's some kind of, I don't want to like speculate, but I'm spent a lot of time in this space. It's like some kind of bacteria or parasite. We're doing a bit of light therapy now, and the frequency stuff. I'm leaning into all of these things. When I say leaning in, so people can listen to me, but we're spending some time on the frequency beds and really trying to understand some of the frequency technology coming out and the light therapy stuff. Have you ever leaned into that much? I'm just curious.
No, I think I think that's where you then come more, let's say, into optimization and other things. I think for Kristian's side here, it is more where, again, obviously we, as you know, we have measured all kinds of biometrics, so everything from blood values from here to, I don't know how many we have tracked at the most, more than 2,000 biometric or blood blood markers, but then mRNAs and proteomics. But I think here in this case, it's more where we haven't really identified the cause yet. So again, I don't feel that it, like, again, I can always sit down and overanalyze.
Of course.
But I think the good thing here is that Kona were more like, for us, it was more it's more obvious that okay, when it happens there with the 2 days before, but with Paris, obviously it's easier to overanalyze. But again, there also that I think it doesn't bring you any direction unless it is obvious, because you want to learn from it. But when things are like this, then you the only thing
Just got to accept it and move on sometimes, and just say it's part of the journey, right? I mean, it's a typical engineering high performance mindset, though. You do, you spend a lot of time going, hang on, what about? And at some point, you just got to say, okay, the journey continues. Let's just figure it out as we go. But enough about the boys for a second. You've announced that you've taken the head coach of Norwegian cycling role. I'm really curious as to your motivation for this. And I was given a question actually from a listener from Kristian Wayland, who says, I want to know why you chose, well, I'm going to say these are his words, not mine. He said, chose a second tier cycling team, and if any other top teams expressed interest in working with you. So I don't mean to judge you on that, but there you go.
A very good question. So this is actually, it's not Norwegian cycling. This is UNOX mobility pro team.
Okay, excuse me.
Yeah, no. So they have it's the world, it's the men's pro tour and women's world tour team. And yes, there actually ended up a couple of contracts on my table before signing with UNOX. The last one actually ended on my table 2 days before actually I signed with with UNOX. No, I actually were very open about the process with Kristian and Gustav as well, and I'd also been in. There have been other projects in racing and also America's Cup that I've been evaluating. But sitting down, discussing with my wife, and then also with the boys, and I asked them, okay, which of the teams do I decide here? They said, Olav, there is, like, this should be obvious. Obviously, you go with UNOX. It's a Norwegian. It's a Norwegian-based team. Like, obviously, they are international. They have international athletes and so on. But the founders, the owners of the team, they are Norwegian, and large part of the team is Norwegian. And of course, it has to do a little bit with the culture. But the other thing is that one of the things that I learned about myself over all this year, being everything from a little bit in more corporate structures to more startups. I like much more the entrepreneurial spirit, the startups, and this kind of thing, because things are much more dynamic. You have a larger possibility to influence direction, and you get involved in much more processes. And the challenge with large teams is that so basically I would say that I've been into corporate structures like large massive performance teams. Like I was working with some of the coaches in America's Cup as well, and one of the things you basically see that is that it's the teams become so large and so little lean that even though whether you're sitting on the top as a CEO or whether you are one of the athletes there, the time it takes from where you have an idea and then basically implement it takes so long time that and in many cases you don't even end up implementing it because of the consequences, or let's say all the consequences that are with it. So I definitely prefer. I am an entrepreneur. I like to build things. That's where my passion is. And for me, the UNOX team felt much more like where the entrepreneurial spirit was. The positivity that is in UNOX is also hands down on another level than it is of some of the other teams. And that was actually one of the things when I was sitting and discussing with some of my friends that are also in cycling, and I asked them a little bit like, okay, who should I go with here? And one of the things they brought up is that UNOX, like, they are known to be a very, very positive, and they have a very positive mindset, very positive culture that is there. And that was one of the things that, unfortunately, when I was sitting and discussing a little bit with some of these other teams, there were even negativity on all the way up on the top level, and not only where you hear maybe in the media athletes and others that are not satisfied with the situation, but you even hear the management and where things are a little bit starting to saturate with negativity, and then it doesn't help. Even if the contract is twice the size, it doesn't really help. So for me, I can say, if you really want to be able to extract everything from yourself, you have to be in a culture where you really get also energy back, because there is a positivity and an energy there and a drive to really move towards becoming the best. And so in the end, the choice for me to go with Uno X was actually very simple. So that's the short and long answer for why my decision fell ultimately on Uno X. Yeah.
And your travel, is it be a bit less going forward, or you got to travel a fair bit with these guys, or how is it managed?
So they knew that I've been traveling quite a bit. So they even said to me, because they knew that I'd been traveling more than 200 days a year. They already knew that, fine, okay, 50 days, we up to 50 days. They said that's fine. You don't have
That's
to
fine.
more than
Yeah.
that. But again, they also know when they say that they of course, on the one side, they show that, okay, they really they care also about
Yeah.
about me and my well-being. But on the other side, also, they know that my mindset is also that, basically, okay, it's nice that we have agreed on that I'm going to travel less than 50 days a year. But then on the other side, I also know very well that I do what is necessary to help drive performance. And if that then requires me to travel 70 days, or worst case 100 days or more, to get these kind of things implemented or move, that's what it takes. That's
And
what
maybe early on, it does take a little bit more until you get the things in place. Yeah, it makes sense.
yeah.
Totally. Now, listen, I want to shift gear a little bit, and I want to talk about core,
Yeah.
and the technology, which is the heat adaptation tool that's all the rave. Are you one of the founders there? What's the role that you have at core?
No, so it was actually Dan Rang that actually put me in contact with them in 2000. I don't remember now, 18 or 19 or something like this. And he said, I need to introduce you to a really smart guy in Core, or Green Tech, as the mother company is called. And his name is Wolf Glatz. And I remember I was a little bit skeptic, because on the one side, we had been screening the market and these kind of things, and this was obviously a sensor that you put on your skin, and it's not a pill or a rectal probe. And we had decided we just wanted to have absolute precision and all that kind of things, so we wanted to go with the pill. But the consequence of the pill is the one that doesn't integrate with the computer, so suddenly you end up operating with two separate systems, and where you need to do a lot of post-processing to bring things together. And the other part is that it's very expensive to do, to like I think a couple of already 4 or 5 pills. So it means basically 4 or 5 sessions, you're already at the same cost as the core sensor is. So but then I obviously I want to stay ahead of what's happening in the market and understand the different technologies. So Dan introduced me to Wolf, and we sat down, and then he started to talk about the technology. And it suddenly occurs to me that these guys are not making a sensor that basically measures the skin temperature, as you would get in many shops, and then it basically adds an offset to that to calculate or to give you a core temperature estimate. What they do comes actually from industry. This is a technology that actually comes from the heavy industry, laser. They even use it in space, but also in actually to validate the insulation values of buildings, constructions. And what they do, which basically caught my interest, is that on the one side they measure the surface temperature, or in this case the skin temperature, but surface temperature of the object that is attached to, or put onto. But they also measure the heat flux. So the heat flux is basically the same as, so when you're biking, to put this into context, when you're biking, you're putting power, but power is an umbrella term. What you really do is, this is mechanical power. we could also actually call that mechanical flux, your mechanical flux. And then to bring that over to the core, so you have surface temperature, but you also measure the heat flux. But then we can also change that and say thermal power. So it measures the thermal power. And we know that for every calorie that you put into your body, and when you're biking, let's say a small portion of that goes to mechanical power. The largest portion of that calorie goes to heat, so thermal power, so heating. And one thing that I've been dreaming of is that in the same way as Formula One cars, where you are always trying to optimize the fuel efficiency. So obviously you have a certain amount of fuel that goes into the engine, but then we also know that combustion engines, they actually, funny enough, have approximately the same efficiency as the human body. They sit in around 20% efficiency. But what they've done, so that means basically that for every liter of fuel, for example, that goes through the engine, 20% goes of that to push the car moving forward, and 80% of that goes to pure heat to the environment. Mm-hmm. What obviously is important in Formula One to keep the weight down and increase the performance is that they have been really good at trying to recycle the heat that is there and actually convert it back into electrical energy, and then basically increase the efficiency of the engine to the point where they now are able to extract almost 50% or around 50% of the fuel. So every liter, 50% they're able to convert into mechanical power now, and 50% is then thermal power or heat. Wow. But that means also that one thing that we discovered accidentally in the lab because of all the testing we have done, and but then obviously much harder to do outdoors, but what we discovered in the lab in 17, 18 or something like this, was that we saw that the body doesn't have a constant efficiency. So it's not like you can say that if you there 20% of the calories goes to mechanical power and then 80% of it goes to heat. This is also a little bit depending on what kind of sport you do, but let's take cycling, for example. So let's say 20-80 there. 20% of a calorie goes to mechanical power, 80% goes to heat or thermal power. So basically, one thing that the thing that we discover there is that we can see, depending on how we put the program together and also other interventions, suddenly we could have massive shifts in this. And what I mean by a massive shift is that we could see efficiency even going above 25%, 26, 27, 28%. And then you think, oh yeah, okay, so that's 25%. Well, how much is that really? And that's 5%. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but it's not 5%. That's 25%, because 20%, and if you can increase that from 20% to 25%, that's not a 5%, that's 5% points, but it's 25%
improvement.
Improvement. And this is so massive that this is something that, okay, fine, because the limitation of elite athletes is obviously the ability to turn around, or they get in enough food, get in enough calories. And then basically, how can we extract more of that into a program that allows us to use more of that for mechanical stimulus or mechanical work? Yeah. And that's where suddenly, like, my eyes just pops up fully, and I say to Wolf, like, I want this technology, but I'm more interested in the capabilities of this sensor, far beyond just the ability to measure the core temperature. So this is actually where it started, and then we started to work more together and on this, and then we started research projects, and today, even to the point where we decided we wanted to we wanted to invest into their technology. So we are co-owners of
Core.
Of Core, and it's one of the coolest projects we are a part of, purely because of the potential in moving forward. You can imagine even here, like for calorie tracking is something that is inherently difficult to do, especially for elites where it matters a lot. Also, you can imagine for people when it comes to longevity or for let's say for weight balance and so on. And if you can have a technology here that is working the same way as like a power meter on a bike, but now suddenly you have a small sensor that you just attach to your body, doesn't have to be on your heart rate monitor belt. You can just put it on your wrist even. But and this can improve how we individualize nutrition moving forward. This has implications far beyond sports, but obviously it's a couple of steps forward. But the technology technology is truly brilliant, and we use it even for tracking the circadian rhythm, because obviously when you use these patches and you just attach it to your body, you can now see throughout the day and the night where your minimum point is, and you can see when we then do um, uh,
Mm.
time shift protocols, you can actually see that it actually the minimum point changes. And we also actually, which is also we have obviously done a lot on clothing, and this is a place where aerodynamics obviously is a big topic, and a lot of people invest a lot in aerodynamics. But for us leading into Tokyo and obviously beyond there, it was more important for us, because when we sat down and we calculated, okay, how much are we gaining here from improving the aerodynamics by 1%, or what we could do with this with the suit, for example, by 1%. We have come to the point, yes, there is still possibility to improve the aerodynamics of the suits and these kind of things, but the thermal improvements that could be done there were massive, because it was not a field that was really well investigated, and we did this with sensors. So that's why there are photos obviously out there where Kristian and Gustav is wearing, like, I think 8 sensors on the body at different places of the body, exactly for the purpose of increasing the thermodynamics of the suits. and
Mm.
and which, yeah, again, there we're not talking about 1%. We saw improvements there in the thermodynamics of so big numbers that you wouldn't believe it if I said it.
That's amazing. You know what I love about this is one of these, a bit like Formula One trickles down, right? You know, you got all
Yeah.
these master engineers. I kind of see this core temperature as, yes, right now it's kind of athletic performance. You know, how do we find marginal gains in, you know, well, it's not even marginal; these are massive gains. If, you know, if we get the percentage gains that we're talking about. But as you just sort of touched on, from circadian cycles, and you think, okay, well, how can an average person use it for just for health?
Mhm.
And you know, you think menstrual cycles and fertility tracking, all of these kinds of things, or even alertness. Or I start to think of how this could impact, you know, the brain and the way we operate. You know, and because I don't know. There's a lot of studies out there, obviously, on the sauna and the ice baths, and how and all of those, obviously, are thermal regulation as well. So it's cool that this is here in terms of performance. But I immediately start to think, okay, how does this become a massive company in itself? You know, I'm a bit of a capitalist, so I'm always thinking about, okay, how can this actually grow into something massive? Because, you know, obviously in performance, it's still a great market. It still do very well. But you think, okay, mass health adaptation would be pretty cool.
Yeah, and then also, like, I think here, like, there are so many things that where we know temperature is a really good indicator of something in the body. That's the one aspect of it. Like, so again, circadian rhythm. There are also health related things. You already mentioned fertility, but I think also on the other side, like, weight obviously is something
Yeah.
that is a concern to a lot of people. And one thing that we know today is that if you want to track your calories, power meters are one of the most, let's say, indirect methods. Obviously, not like there are variations between person to person, but it's a very accurate way of tracking how much kilojoules you obviously are, or much you're outputting. But that means also that it's much easier to say then, okay, how much calories do you need after certain rides and these kind of things. Obviously,
Mm.
that's one of the places where teams have gotten better. But the thing is that that is where you measure, call it the little brother. The big brother is the thermal power, and where you have more variations. But if you can track that part of it, that means suddenly now that you have a power meter, or a calorie tracker that is then the least invasive, least intrusive technology that you actually can have, that gives you the most accurate measure also of calories that you can get
Mm.
access to, because it measures directly on the body. Like, if there is no calories, you are basically, excuse my language, you are dead. Like, if you're dead, you don't produce any heat anymore. But the more you do, the more heat you do, the more you rest, the less heat it is, and this is directly correlated. And that's a place where I think, like, for the mass market, like calorie tracking and weight, or, yeah, that is,
Fascinating.
yeah.
you, you know what I'm thinking is, you know, at my office I have the stand up desk and the walking treadmill, and you know, I'm kind of conscious, especially after lunch and everything else, about getting, you know, 10 minutes of rapid walking in. So I try to, you know, Even if I'm in a meeting, somebody will see me, my head bopping up and down. I'm walking as fast as I can, and most of it's the mindset of it's not so much exercise; it's about trying to just really warm myself up. Like it's like a once I feel myself starting to almost sweat, I'm like, okay, I'm good to go. It's like, and you know, and I mean, that's simplifying, obviously, what you're talking about, but I do think that's fantastic. I want to shout out to Jesse Van Holst, who asked a question about this heat, and so did Ima Sigurd Johnson, who also asked about heat and training. And I think you've covered that really well. I want to move on to Beto Natrini, who big shout out to Beto. He has his own podcast down in Brazil, big supporter of the show and triathlon. And he asks, you know, the Norwegian method, do you regard it basically as your creation, or is it a combination of existing techniques? So I think what we could do is basically, can you explain at a high level, 30,000 feet, if you like, the Norwegian method and how it's evolved?
To be actually, I don't, or we actually don't call what we do. It is something that actually have been.
It's just the method.
Yeah, well, actually, I would even say it's actually something that other call it something that other people just put on us. Oh, they are doing the Norwegian method, and
Yeah,
we.
yeah.
Well, are we really doing the Norwegian method? Is it really? And obviously, at some point, it came to the point where we just said, "Hey, let's call." Because one of my partners, so Adam Ackworth, okay, let's do a podcast, and he basically says, let's just call it the Norwegian method because that's what everybody associates us with. But no, I'm absolutely not an inventor of the Norwegian method, and we don't even coin what we do the Norwegian method.
Yeah.
But you could say that, like, if you go back and you look at what have maybe been called the Norwegian method is stems a little bit from double threshold and using lactate as a gauge of intensity. But we have taken it much farther than that.
Well, I think there's a lot of people that are really curious about this one. Callum McLeod said he's curious about how you define LT1 and LT2. You just talked about lactate, and given the various approaches across sports, so he wants to know how you define LT1 and LT2.
So I think here the reason for why LT1 and LT2 is interesting is that we can always also talk about VT1 and VT2. We can talk about Alpha 1, Alpha 2. We can talk about critical power and FTP and VO2 max. Like there's no lack of carb max and fat max. There's no lack of different terminologies. But the reason for why LT1 and LT2 is a little bit of more interest is that, in contrast to, for example, VT1 and VT2. So VT1 is basically the first ventilatory threshold, and VT2 obviously being the second ventilatory threshold. But the impracticalities with that is that it requires much more expensive equipment to measure those two. And secondly, is that you won't be able to do that very practically out in the field either. Like, obviously, you have now portable metabolic analyzers like the VO2 Master, but again, you're not going to ride a whole full session with the VO2 Master on your face. You use it to check regularly a little bit what's happening there. The contrast is that LT1 and LT2, you can measure this, or you can check this, but then other thing is that you can also apply to the field, because you can bring your lactate meter out into the field. So again, what is important for me is that when we talk about different thresholds, it needs to be something that not only applies to a lab, but that is actually practically implementable also in the field. And that's why obviously power meters or heart rate numbers also are very practical to use, because they apply directly to the field. So how do we define LT1 and LT2? To make it very simple, we are looking LT1 and LT2. It's not a fixed value, and it's not a value that stays constant either over time. It's influenced by hydration. It's influenced by environment. There are several things that influences this, and that means that also, if you go by a number or LT1, it means basically that all other parameters will need to operate within a zone. So if you say that, okay, if you every day went out and said, I'm going to target 0.7 millimoles, for example, That means that one day the power could be higher, one day the power had to be lower. One day the heart rate could be maybe a little bit higher, another day a little bit lower for the same lactate value. But the point is to be consistent on one system. And what we look for when we look for LT1 is basically that when you do, for example, you do incremental increases in power. So let's say you do a step protocol. What you're looking for there is that when you increase the power, obviously at some point you might not even see a change in lactate. It doesn't mean that lactate doesn't change, but it has more to do with the measurement method. If you had a lactate meter inside your muscle, you would basically see that there is obviously lactate at rest. You can also measure this with your portable lactate meter, but you will see that for every increment you do, there is an increase in lactate. But before this shows up as an increased value on a lactate meter, it means basically that the volume of lactate that is produced in your muscle have to be large enough that it starts to saturate more into the bloodstream as well. So what we're looking for there when we look for LT1 is basically when you do, let's say that you go 200 watts and then you go 220 watts and then you go to 240 watts or whatever. It can be whatever step size you decide to go with. You're looking for basically where there suddenly starts to be a linear increase in between power and lactate. So at a low enough value, you will basically see that there's almost no change in lactate at all. So even if you go up from 200 to 220, for example, or depending on how fit you are, you would basically say that, okay, let's say it was 0.7 you measure on the first one. So you had a good warm up, but then after that warm up, you say, so 200 watts, 0.7, then you do 220, then you see 0.7. That means you have not yet come to LT1. And maybe you could even see that it's 0.9 and it even goes down to 0.7. But again, this is an indication of that you really haven't found LT1 yet. Where you're looking for is basically when you start to see that it starts to become a linear increase in your lactate value. That's normally what we call LT1. And the reason for why that is an interesting point is because you can imagine that on easy rides before you're going to have a hard ride, you want to basically preserve as much of, for example, your glycogen stores and other things like this. And especially when you do double threshold days, this becomes even more important to make sure that you maximize the possibility to really excel on your hard workouts. So then measuring LT1 and then going out and you check your lactate, you see, okay, fine, this is the value I am at, or you lower down a little bit. But that's why we measure LT1, and that's how I would say, simply speaking, that's how you also identify LT1, where it goes from, let's say, a flat to a more linear increase in lactate concentration. And then this LT2 is basically where you again find a second inflection point, and this is basically normally a little bit lower than people would expect. So let's say if you compare it to FTP or critical power or even VT2, you would normally see that LT2 sits as a lower power number than your FTP sits. So people typically, it's again, these are gliding transition. It's not a hard transition, but it's again where you see a second inflection point on your curve. And the way to validate this is that you would do, for example, like a asymmetric or acyclic test afterwards, or out in the field where you say, okay, today we're going to do 6 times 10 minutes, but then you do pairwise. So you do, for example, then the first one, so let's say you found out in the lab that you think, oh, my LT2 sits around, just one second. So one way to validate the LT2 is that, again, when you are in a lab and you do an incremental test, we also have to remember that LT1 and LT2 is also not only affected by power, but also duration. So that will also influence it. But that means also that when you do a step test in a lab, where you find LT2 there, so the power number you find, or you think, or you estimate your LT2 to be at, both in terms of concentration, but also what kind of power volume it is then, this is something that I would always encourage to say that, okay, now we have something ballparkish here, but the goal would be that when you're out in the field, you're looking at doing, for example, on a cyclic test where you do, for example, let's say that you did interval session 6 times 10 minutes, and the goal was to be at LT2. The way you then would do it is that you to just throw out some numbers. Let's say we found out that the LT2 was 2.8 2.8 millimoles.
Mm-hmm.
That, and you said, oh, that's 300 watts. That means that when you're out riding now in the field, you would just start below that, a little bit below. But
Mm-hmm.
the likelihood is that it actually is higher, simply because most people are able to ride a little bit higher power outdoors than what they do indoors. So then when you're out in the field, you ride 290 watts, and you get a lactate value there on the first, after the first 10 minutes, and you see, okay, that actually is lower. So it was maybe, let's say it was 2.1 now. So if it's, then you could on the one side say that I'm not going to do then another one, because I think it's already lower than what it should. So I would then go already there probably to 300 watts. So now you're at 300 watts. Obviously, lactate will go up now, and less almost all cases it will go up. But that would mean that then maybe you saw now 2.5 millimoles, and I say, okay, fine, we can go a little bit higher. But now it's getting close to that. So instead of jumping up 20 watts, I would go maybe up 10 watts. So I go 10 watts, and now I see that now it sits around 2.8 millimoles. But I don't know yet. I don't know really whether this is a value that, or let's say your MLS says, your maximum lactate steady state. So what I would do there in this case, I would maybe then do another interval first at the same value. So I'm still going 310 watts, and I see, okay, so yeah, it is still 2.8, or it could be 2.9 or 2.7, but let's say within the technical error of measurement. Now, what I would do there is that to confirm whether I'm there or not, I would actually now increase it to 315 or 320. Let's say 320. So you go to 320 in watts. Lactate will obviously go up now, but the first indicator you have here is how big the jump is in lactate. So if you go now from 310 to 320, and it goes from 2.8 to 3.5, then most likely you are going to be above, because there's a large jump in lactate.
Yeah, too
but
much.
But you could at the same side say that, well, you don't know 100% yet. So the next thing you would then continue, you would do one more interval at 320. But what would be the confirmation now is that if it now basically still increase it for the same power number, then you know you're above. And that means also that now you have confirmed that basically, lactate LT2 is, you can't 100% say what is where between 2.8 and 3.5, but that will also be indicated by how much it increases. So if you go 320, you're 3.5 on the first one, and the next one you have 4.2, the likelihood is that it's the power number sits closer to 310 than 320. And also in this case, that the lactate concentration is also closer to 2.8 and 3.5. So let's say 2.9 or something like this. That's at least a good starting point. Then the next session you go out, you would then, instead of going all the way from 2.8 and up there, you would probably say, okay, this is now we have a no threshold session, and you go out and you aim to be maybe already at 3.5, 3.05 or 3.10 at your first interval, and now you basically just check a couple of times during your interval. But
it's amazing.
Yeah.
You know what? How much of it does the athlete themselves just really start to get a feel for it? Like you test and test on your side, and then the athlete starts to go, oh yeah, I actually felt like, I know I went from a 2.9 to a 3.5. I can feel it. Like, do you get that feedback a bit? Yeah.
Yes, they are. You can't, obviously you can't really feel lactate, but you because you have gotten this feedback so many times, you've seen the numbers, you see this transition, you obviously start to connect this with a feeling in your body. And that means actually also when you know this, so you said, okay, this feeling, I know that when I have this feeling in my body, then it normally is around 2.9, for example. And that means also that when we test, and obviously if you start to do, let's say, some high intensity intervals that you're not used to do, or you start to ride some power numbers that you're not used to, obviously it's much harder to estimate where your lactate value is going to be. But for Kristian and Gustav, when we test the fairly broad spectrum, and we also repeat this in the high intensity session, medium and low intensity sessions, it is to the point where Kristian and Gustav have made it a sport, almost like guessing the second decimal. So when we're using lab machine, and we are not talking about 2.9, but it's actually 2.97, for example, they actually are trying to guess the second decimal, because that's how used they are to use lactate. So if it is 2.7, the likelihood that they're actually going to say 2.7, that is, I would say, there are larger likelihood for that they will actually hit it on the dot than actually being off by more than 0.2.
It becomes a game.
Yes.
Trying to figure it out. You're like, oh, okay, I want to see if I can get. It's like guessing your sleep score in the morning. I
Yeah.
I have a question from Braden Gray, which I just want to talk about. He's curious about the tech tools that you would recommend for most sort of amateur athletes. He's mentioned Moxie, Core, or VO2 Master, all of which you've had, you know, some doings with. But is there any, this is a conversation I've had with a lot of people. What kind of tech we should all be bringing in? What's the maybe one you'd gift to a friend? It gets expensive. So is there kind of one thing, one product, a Garmin or an Oura or a Whoop or any of these other tools that you kind of go, hey, this would be a great one to put in your toolkit?
I would. Whoops and auras, unfortunately, are not my. uh, for me, it's important that one user uses reliable, and let's say sound technology.
Mm,
I'm a big fan of first principle thinking, and also then dividing it into different orders. And if we look a little bit on what is these technologies really doing, to output a certain number, for me it very helps often to assess these technologies or whatever we do, even if it's a training program, to assess this by first principle. So what are the fundamentals? So for example, one thing that I think most people don't realize today is that when you get a sleep score, that is so many, it's so far from first principle and so many orders down the list that it's not what we even would. It's not a fundamental metric. It's not an inferred metric. It's not a derived metric even. It's basically a very speculative metric based on correlations on models, meaning that it's I feel it's an industry driven more by creating some kind of unique selling points to be able to sell
mm,
tech than necessarily that it is really for the good, or yeah, for the good of say humanity. So for me, I would say that what kind of technology you should purchase. There are many exciting things on the horizon that are coming that really are really useful technologies, but the ones that are on the market now, obviously temperature actually core is a really nice technology. And why? You could, even if you have, let's say that you have a kid, like for example, I have course at home, and if the kids have high core temperature, or high temperature, like, and you're a little bit worried about, I need to track this. So instead of disrupting their sleep, actually just putting it into, let's say, putting on the body, for example, just with either with a patch or put it in the pocket, that is actually a brilliant way to track their core temperature in real time on their phone. I can just open my phone, I can check, okay, fine, their like temperature is there. Like for example,
wow, that's awesome, isn't
yeah,
it? Yeah.
that is like for parents and everything. And
Yeah.
when you have small kids, this is brilliant. Is really brilliant. So that is actually a technology that is also coming, not only applicable to sports, but it's actually super useful outside as well, when you want to keep track of this. But then I would say, um, yeah, GPS technology, or basically GR is called, like
Yeah.
the real term for it is actually GNSS, global navigation satellite systems, but it popularizes GPS, but that's the American, that is the US satellite system. You also have Baidu and Galileo and many of these satellite systems that basically these watches are using, but to make it simple, yeah, watches with GPS, I would say GPS technology is really useful. It's not
Yeah.
flawless, but that is, I would say, maybe the most fundamental thing to have to track, whether that is for fitness, health, or for performance. It is just so basic that I would say that's very important. Whether that is in the form of an Apple Watch or a Google Watch, or a Garmin watch, really doesn't matter, as long as it is something that helps you track that. Then obviously power meters are, but now you're getting up one grade more expensive. But power meters are still actually a very untapped resource. People think power meters are power meters, but the most advanced power meters we have now. So we work with one company called Body Rocket, and with their power meter technology, one of the things we can do there is that most people don't think about this, but when you look at the power number on your computer, what you track is actually what we call net mechanical power. It's basically only the power that acts in the propulsive direction of the crank, or basically for the bike. Only power that moves. That means that, let's say that you have poor biomechanics or you have a poor pedaling stroke and these kind of things. It doesn't measure your gross mechanical power. It measures only net mechanical power. But these new power meters now, they measure net mechanical power, gross mechanical power, but they also measure how you actually pedal throughout the pedaling. So you can also imagine here that from a purely physical, not physiological, but from a physics standpoint, you would always like to produce the power perpendicular to the crank arm, so that you have almost always an ideal power vector or force vector compared to the crank arm. But this is not the case. What you'll see there is that this is one, it changes from what kind of athlete you are. It two, changes also with how long you've been training or like what kind of level you are at. But also this will change with injuries. It will change with if something is starting to fatigue. So that is actually something that is really, and then you also have force velocity plots. There's so much details that can be extracted from power meters that people don't actually realize. And then obviously I am a big fan of metabolics because that's a little bit like when you have an end, like a car. If you can measure on the one side the velocity, so you have the GPS in this case, for example. So you measure the velocity. That in the end, that's the ultimate metric of performance. And then in the middle there, you have power meter, which tells something about efficiency, like how much kilowatts, or to use our old term, horsepower is the car producing there. Because if you measure these two, you can say something about aerodynamics already there. Because if you go at a certain speed and you make a change on the car and its control conditions, then you already know, oh, now the aerodynamics are worse or better, depending on where the power goes up and down. But then what it doesn't say something about, you can still have a greatly inefficient engine, meaning that if you can also measure now VO2, you have basically the full thing. Then you measure basically what happened on the combustion side or the fuel side. You measure what happens on the engine side, and you measure on what happens on the speed side, and it gives you an opportunity to really fine tune this whole system that is there. So yeah,
that's awesome. That's very visual. I'm a visual person, mate, and the way you just described that, I can see all the phases. I was like, yeah, I love that data-driven insights, like in each phase of the testing of the human body and performance.
Yeah,
really cool, mate. Look, we've been going for a little while now, and I'm very cognizant of your time. I know your kids and family are downstairs waiting to have you join for dinner now that you are back home. I do want to quickly just shout out a few people we didn't get specifically to their questions, but I think you did cover a lot of what their questions, and that's Savlaki Street, Luz RN5, Andreas Stopper Up, Larry Warbassen, and Carlos Furtado. I think Olav did a really good job here of covering so much. And I do appreciate everybody for sending in so many questions. I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch more as well. But mate, Olive, I just, I love our chats. I hope we get to continue these maybe every sort of 6 months, because I feel like your insights into the world are always fantastic. And even just as a mate, I just enjoy catching up. But look, it's been really great having you back on the show. But before we wrap up, where do listeners, follow you now? You work with Core and Uno X cycling team. Where do they follow you to maybe keep learning from what you got going on?
Yeah, so obviously I'm not that very active on social medias. I said a couple of times before I should probably be better, and I would like to be better at it, but I struggle with really finding the time to prioritize it. But LinkedIn is, I would say, probably one of the channels I would probably prioritize if I do it. Then obviously it is Instagram, and I think both my Instagram and my LinkedIn is Olav Aleksander in one word, or Olav Aleksander Bu. So with a KS in Alexander, but Olav Aleksander Bu. Those are the only two social medias I really have. I think I have a Strava account, and I know I have probably like 1,000 follower request or something like that there. But I basically go into Strava like once a year or something like this. And then
I get it.
it's for completely other reasons. No. Uh, yeah, but then again, I think also podcasts, like you said, like
Yeah.
for us, like that's probably the place where some of the updates will come moving forward. So yeah, keep an eye out.
Well, we've got to get you to the US. I want to get you to meet the team at Volerage Health
Yes,
here. You know,
yes,
you and I have talked about that.
yeah,
A lot of the learnings that, like I mentioned in the show, that we learn from the professional athletes and the top performers in the world. It's, you know, I'm now in a place where my focus is on health and longevity for all,
yeah.
and using a lot of the performance tools that we might use in
Mhm.
high performance, and how do we get out to the masses. And I think, you know, when you were talking about some of the tech tools, I'll just reinforce. I've said on this show, these are tools that you can use for a period of time. Sometimes it can be a great behavioral change. You know, like we were talking, you mentioned a Whoop and Aura, and they may not be perfect, but some of the trade offs could be the fact that, you know, they might just help you be more aware that
Yeah,
having too many drinks at night lowers your HRV or whatever. And it might be worth it. Like my whole thing is sometimes having a few drinks
exactly.
with friends is worth it. So,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. But I think that is a very good point because I think you should still live your life the way
yes,
that brings positivity to it. But
yes.
there can be learnings from it that allows you to optimize some things. But then when you want to optimize something, like pick one thing. Like don't start out like trying to do everything at one time. That's
Yeah.
never gonna work in the long run.
Mate, I love it. I love these chats, buddy.
Same. Yeah.
And I really, again, once again, I appreciate you. I I appreciate the audience and the listeners
Same.
for listening to us all the way to the end here, mate. But I know it's dinner time. The kids are yelling out, "Dad, come and eat." Um, and so again, mate, I don't want to eat into that family time, but I appreciate you, buddy.
Thank you. The same, Greg.
All
Love it.
right, cheers, mate. Stay on the line.